What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Does it fester like a sore and run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Sugar and crust over like a syrupy sweet? Does it sag like a heavy load? Or does it explode? Langston Hughes wrote this poem entitled Harlem in 1951 in relationship to a larger montage that he published that year, speaking to the deferred dream of an American democracy that recognized the reality of all of its citizens as equal and equitable in relationship to the society. In 1959, Lorraine Hansberry took the third line of that poem and wrote the Broadway hit, A Raisin in the Sun. In this play, she speaks to the racial segregation infused by the housing industry and relationships of communities in Chicago, arguably still one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Yes, in post-Obama's America. I grew up in the shadows of these questions in the midst of communities asking for what happens to dreams deferred. On the south side of Chicago, as a little girl in Roseland, I watched my neighborhood turn from once a vibrant community to economically deprived. And every time that I go home, I see the saturation of poverty in this neighborhood, because as my family moved in, other families moved out. And along with other families, so did industry and economy. And so I ask myself, and in my community and with my family, what happens to a dream deferred? What do we do with the putrid smell of racism that continues to infuse our society? And as I moved on from the south side of Chicago to Atlanta for undergraduate school, I looked even within that community and asked ourselves, is it drying up like a raisin in the sun as I witnessed the intra-racial prejudices? Knowing that for some people, even in all of our blackness, that some skin was too dark and others too light, and hair was good and bad, even if you had none. And so what happens to a dream deferred? And as I went on to graduate school at Purdue University, for the first time in my life, and yes, in the millennium, I was told that I was that infamous word. And I couldn't believe it as the most classic example of stereotype. A pickup truck, a raggedy pickup truck, full of corn-fed Indiana white boys ran down the street and yelled out this cacophony of nigger. What happens to a dream deferred? So in each of my realities, as I stand in spaces and places, whether it is ministry, whether it is professing community activism work, I ask this question of our country: what happens to a dream deferred? As I look on each side of Black Lives Matter, are we in a moment of explosion? But I no longer want to continue asking what happens to a dream deferred, but create the spaces in which we ask and breathe and live what happens to an idea of justice, of humanity, of compassion, of love that's given room to grow. How do we create the communities and the classrooms and the congregations and the activities that allow us to live in our full humanity? For I am Stephany Rose, daring to dream.